So now I will hand over to Professor Stefano Zamani to talk a bit about the economic implications behind trafficking.
Thank you very much, President Harcher. The topic of human trafficking has evolved from sensational interest in the early 90s to maturity as a recognized global problem at present moment. Yet, in spite of all major efforts, there are still three grand myths persisting in the way the global human trafficking is usually addressed. And I do believe that these myths have to be banished. The first one is the opinion that there is nothing new. Trafficking is age-old, it is often said. Therefore, the skeptics would argue that since trafficking has always been a nuisance, it is a threat that we can learn to live with, as we have done in the past. Now, this attitude ignores the important transformation occurring in our society since the 90s, in particular, the globalization phenomenon and the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution. Because these new phenomena have changed not so much the nature of the trafficking, but the way it is expressed. A second myth is that the trafficking is just about crime. Now, it is true that criminal activities surged and became global since the 90s. But thinking about trafficking as just another manifestation of criminal behavior misses a larger point: the role played by demanders of the services of trafficked people in the various sectors. In the usual criminal activities, there is no demand. Nobody demands criminal activities. But in the case of trafficking, there is not only a supply dimension, but a demand dimension. And the third myth is the idea that human trafficking is an underground phenomenon. Even accepting that it has grown in volume and complexity, many seek to relegate it to a different world than that of ordinary situation. In other words, the idea is that, after all, trafficking is a part of our society about which we can, let's say, close one eye or the other, etc. And again, that is very dangerous, in my opinion, as an illusion, because it tends to treat the problem simply in a moralistic way. Now, human trafficking could be approached in multiple ways: as a moral issue, a public order problem, a labor question, a human rights problem, a migration issue, or, as I said, a matter of organized crime. So far, most of the focus has been on the migration and organized crime component of trafficking. And that is another factor which is producing, at least so far, detrimental results. Why? Because the emphasis on trafficking as a migration and immigration problem has led to the criminalization of victims who generally violate prostitution and immigration laws of the hosting countries. So despite their traumatic victimization, these persons tend to receive only very limited assistance from the authorities in the countries in which they were forced to work in one way or the other. Neither regular admonitions by UN agencies nor accusation by civil society organizations have changed this approach. Today, it has become clear that immediate repatriation of trafficked people, because they are undocumented migrants, generally prevents the successful prosecution of the traffickers. And that is a real, at least to me, a real paradox, because the victims are doubly damaged to this regard. Now, what is striking in all this is that the vast literature dealing with human trafficking is the near total neglect of the demand side for trafficking flows. And this is another paradox, to say the least. If one considers that trafficking is driven by high profits, or by rent-seeking attitudes, it is obvious that it is the demand side, the engine sustaining this trade. It is the demand for cheap labor, for organ transplants, etc., for sexual activities that explain how traffickers and their networks have continually adopted and refined their activities, even at the cost of temporary setbacks, such as jail sentences. Until traffickers face diminished incentives to trade, which means less demand and lower margins, it is futile to talk about increasing criminal justice measures, which have to exist. In other words, the point I would like to raise is that it is true that traffickers are nasty people, we say a lot of many times. But what about those who purchase these services? For instance, what about the families that rely on illegal aliens for domestic help? We will never make progress in the struggle against trafficking if all our attention is placed on the suppliers of most morally repugnant trades and not also the upright citizens whose appetite for them creates the incentives that make it all possible. So that is why, in light of this remark, it is important to go to an idea which is a very recently entered in different realms, for instance, the social doctrine of the church and many other entities, namely socially responsible consumers. We have been accustomed to talk about corporate social responsibility, which is an important issue. But we have to start to talk about consumer social responsibility, because the act of consumption is an act not neutral from a moral point of view, as we know, etc. And in this regard, also, we have to consider that the corporate social responsibility at the international or transnational level has to face a delicate question, which I'm finishing my time, and so I only mention the point. As we know, the notion of market complicity. Sometimes the consequences of an economic actions are not direct, are indirect, and operate via the price mechanism, as all economists know very well, and other hidden mechanisms. So it is obvious that unless a multinational or transnational corporation take the decision to take into consideration the effects operating via the supply chains, it is obvious that the problems that we are talking about will not be solved. In particular, there is today a big debate at the international level, in particular United Nations, whether we should ask multinational corporations to apply the Sullivan principles or the Ruggie principles. As you know, the Sullivan principles, after they were prepared in the 80s, last century. On the other hand, the Ruggie principles were approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations in November 2011. Now, if we look at them carefully, we observe that there are certain contradictions. So the question is, what should we ask multinationals? To follow the Sullivan principles or the Ruggie principles? This is an open problem, about which, in my opinion, something must. A second important was mentioned by President Archer, has to do with the creation of what we might call VATA, a World Anti-Trafficking Agency. Because we know that the current state system, based on territorial sovereignty, is characterized by uneven state capacity to tackle with the issue we are talking about. This fact suggests why it is urgent to move decisive steps towards the creation of a World Anti-Trafficking Agency. Indeed, in the absence of such an agency that can enforce the rules laid down in the various conventions and treaties, for instance, the Palermo Protocol, the trafficking problem will never find an adequate solution. Just to give a parallel, not an analogy, in the past we have created WTO, the World Trade Organization, or we have created the Basel Committee, to look after the behavior of major banks. Why not creating another agency dealing with the anti-trafficking problem? And finally, a further final suggestion has to do with the fact that we really need to create a sort of a metric which is capable of taking into consideration the impact of anti-trafficking activity. So far, we do not have a metric on the basis of which to gauge whether or not the various anti-trafficking activity produced the desired effect. And since billions of dollars are beginning to be directed at the root causes of human trafficking, unless we have such a metric, and somebody has to produce that. And it is not difficult, in my opinion, to arrive at a consensus on that. A metric which does take into consideration not only the quantitative dimension of the phenomenon, but also the qualitative dimension, because we always have to remind is that only qualitative attributes can be measured, provided that we utilize a proper metric. So it's not true that only quantities can be measured. That is an old positivistic, in epistemology, a positivistic assumption, which today nobody adheres with. This is another important contribution to which perhaps different people stemming from this initiative and many other present in this room might take in order to propose, because the risk otherwise is to waste the resources, which are limited, and not only it's a matter of waste, but also could be a problem of producing perverse effects. In other words, unintended consequence of intentional action. These are few, let's say, suggestions which, in my opinion, can be implemented in order to come to cope with most disgraceful phenomena of our times. If we stop perhaps complaining or crying on the phenomenon, as we keep on doing, and start to move some step forwards in this direction, perhaps the day will come when we will observe at least a diminution of the phenomenon under consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, Stefano, for being, as usual, crystal clear and getting to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter really being that these various forms of work that trafficked people are directed towards, forced labor, prostitution, bonded labor, organ harvesting, domestic servitude, and many other subdivisions within those, we want to render all of them unsustainable in economic terms. And, well, this is the point at which to turn to Pierpaolo Donati, and he's going to tell us how to work on the normative demand side to make the use and the products and the services of trafficked people less desirable, and in fact, in some cases, stigmatized. And as demand falls, then profits will fall, and then we hope supply will fall. It would be very nice if it worked in that direct sequence. Pierpaolo.
Thank you, Professor Archer. I have to talk about morality, which means moral norms. That is the link between the two topics we are discussing today, climate change on one side and human trafficking on the other. I think that the morality issues are strictly parallel, but that they have their own specificity in the two different fields of the natural and social sciences. Of course, I agree with what was said this morning. Basically, the fundamental statement by Jeffrey Sachs, we are fundamentally facing a moral challenge. And the other statement by General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, we cannot negotiate with nature, we have to behave morally. Now the question is, does it apply to society as it applies to physical nature? Of course, morality, as I've said, is a parallel issue and the general criteria are the same. But of course, in the social field, the endeavor is much more complex than in the other field. It's so difficult that we have to really think about the moral change in our society and how we can foster the common good and different relations among people when facing the issue of human trafficking. In Stefano's paper, the thesis was we have to make unsustainable human trafficking from an economic point of view. Now, in my field, in the field I have to cope with, the issue is what can make unsustainable morally a certain situation in which people are trafficked or enslaved. Now, my answer very synthetically is that what makes these situations unsustainable basically is the unsatisfaction for human relations. We have to look at how people find themselves in the different circumstances and ask ourselves how they are satisfied in their relationships with the other people or not, in what way, to which degrees, and so on and so forth. Now, to come to the issue that Professor Archer has talked about, human trafficking as a specific field, I think that there is a general agreement that in order to combat human trafficking effectively, prevention is the most rational and fruitful strategy. Of course, this is also true in the climate issues. But particularly in this field, in the social field, before asking for more restrictions, more repressive norms, which have a limited impact and sometimes perverse effects, we needed to understand how to foster a new culture of human social relations and their intrinsic normativity as the basis of a new morality for the common good. So I am referring to the need to transform social relations in which the other person is reduced to a commodity, what Martin Buber calls the I-it relationship, into a relationship I-you, in which everybody can be recognized in his, her human dignity. Of course, this is our task, and it's not very easy to deal with it in practice, but I will make some suggestions. First of all, I think we should be aware of the historical novelty. We are passing from the old forms of slavery to new ones. While the past forms of human slavery were legitimized by traditional customs within an established normative order, it is precisely the disappearing of that old society that fuels the modernized forms of human slavery. I think it is worthwhile noticing that new slavery takes profit from the desertification of society and also of the ecosystem. People who escape from the desertification of the ecosystem is also escaping from the desertification of society, that is, they enter into a condition of poverty and become possible victims of human trafficking. So there is a societal warming, not only a global physical warming. And I think that we could work on this parallel, which could be useful to, in a sense, stimulate a moral thinking in the two fields. Second observation, the changes in Western morality do not help much in combating human slavery. As a matter of fact, socio-cultural systems today are supported by a contingent morality that decides case by case, based on the situation, what is good and what is bad. On these grounds, the acts of exploitation of human beings, as well as of the environment, I think, become less clear, except in extreme cases with violence, etc., etc. So, on what I would call post-modern moral grounds, willing or not, the commodification of human beings is bound to increase because there are no unconditional norms against buying and selling sex performances, buying and selling body organs, offering and accepting jobs that are not protected. In what a colleague of mine, Doug Purpura, is a post-ethical society, the violation of human rights becomes a matter of moral indifference, or better, a matter of utility. We must be aware of that. So globalization fosters a morality of marketization of the whole society, and our task is to oppose this tendency by mobilizing the moral virtues of people. What I want to emphasize is the fact that Western culture is trapped into clear contradictions in fighting human trafficking, I would say, as well as in combating climate changes. On one side, society pushes towards the criminalization of human exploitation. On the other side, it does so on very fragile grounds, because the mainstream idea is that it is not the task of criminal law to apply moral standards. This is true in many European countries, although not all of them, particularly not in Scandinavian countries. The law is separated from morality and becomes adiaphoric. That means generally it avoids the reference to moral values because the values, moral values, are highly conflictual. The law is more and more reduced to administrative measures, so that the moral dimensions of social relations are reduced to a matter of private choices. Public institutions simply try to reduce the negative effects, so that generally public institutions adopt what we call the doctrine of damage reduction, which is totally insufficient in terms of combating human trafficking. So we need to know more about the situational contexts in which human trafficking occurs in terms of normativity of the social networks in which people are entrapped. In order to eradicate the relationship between traffickers and trafficked people, we have to better inspect the relations between public authorities and traffickers in order to avoid collusions and corruption, acts of corruptions, because they are there in many cases. Then we have to know more about the moral norms that govern the economic markets producing the exploitation of human beings. There are very many different markets in the sense of systems of exchange in which social exchanges produce the exploitation of people. So that we can look for the promotion of those civil subjects. I think of the third sector organizations, civil entrepreneurs, social private associations, pro-social communities, community foundations, social streets, etc., who are carriers of an ethics of solidarity and social inclusion. To my mind, a clear struggle emerges between public powers, national and international legislation, ILO, EU regulations, even UN recommendations, and private behaviors fueled by globalization. Our task is to redirect private morality to new structures of social morality. And in order to do that, we have to understand morality as a social fact, not as an individual fact or a system or institutional fact. I don't want to get into the details of this, which is a sociological debate between individual methodologism and holistic methodology. But the real fact is that we do not know exactly how morality emerges from social interactions. We have to change the social networks where people live, both traffickers and trafficked people, in order to ensure that they can act reflexively on their relations with other people. This can be done by activating forms of relational feedbacks on their own social relations, so to change their interests and orient them to a common good. In the globalized society, alongside the processes of privatization and collectivization of moral norms, a dynamic of morality is emerging that is opening a space for new moral norms that are the expression of interhuman relationality as the autonomous mediation between individual morality and institutional morality. These norms are originated in a social space that is neither private nor public. Moral norms become public at a later time. I am referring to those civil spheres of society in which new moral norms are elaborated because they have to meet the relational needs of a social fabric of an associative type, which is not finding adequate answers in society's institutional arrangements. I think of social cooperatives, social enterprises, groups, networks, communities operating to empower people and to enhance their human and social capital. This process is already occurring in a number of productive practices which work according to a logic, or we could say a morality, where the value of things is related to the quality and property of social relations that circulate those things and not to a principle of functional performance. This logic is intrinsically a form of social morality. Ethical labor, the economy in which the social relation is the value before the value of the thing. Ethical labor comes to defining a new ethical economy. Now, before coming to the conclusion in a minute, I want to mention also the role of the mass media. Of course, mass media are very important in dealing with human trafficking because they play a mediating role in influencing the morality and also the actions of the social networks in which human trafficking occurs. To my mind, it is possible to involve the old and the new mass media in feeding a proper solidarity towards trafficked people. Communication media can be a means to develop a moral strategy for an agonistic solidarity with trafficked people. What I mean? Sociological research shows that the moral solidarity of the ordinary spectator on TV and mass media in general towards the trafficked people generally is expressed in terms of pity and or fatalism. So I think is in respect to climate changes, pity, fatalism. I cannot do anything about that. Now, is it possible to spread other forms of solidarity with people trafficked? Yes, I think we can orient the mass media, including social networks, blogs, etc., to orient themselves to forms of what I call agonistic solidarity, or if you prefer agonistic sociability, which means to treat human vulnerability as a political question of injustice that can become the object of our collective reflection, empathetic emotion, and transformative action. This is proven to be true provided that we understand that collective reflection, empathetic emotion, and transformative action depend on the sense attributed by people to their human social relations in their situational contexts, insofar as the common good is really practiced as a relational good. A relational good means a good which consists in good relations, virtuous relations. Now I come to the conclusion. I think it's important the role of the education in schools. Schools can provide for a civic education aimed at stigmatizing those production and consumption behaviors that can have negative effects towards trafficking human beings. Then the role of the church can be fundamental in many ways. First, in actively blessing and promoting a culture of free giving in helping people to avoid the traffickers, and in spreading a culture of organ donations, and moreover in convincing families to remove domestic servitude. In sum, the effective implementation of human rights and state legislation depends on how we can develop a civil morality in a global society. This is not a trivial assumption, since many people believe that morality depends on state action or on the action of abstract systems. The action of the nation state is absolutely necessary, but it runs the risk of being ineffective due to the fact that human trafficking is a globalized phenomenon that is largely beyond the control of the nation state. So we need to foster a global civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And of course, you'll have noticed the connection between the three of us, and it will become the four of us in a second, that we are completely abandoning positivism. We're abandoning head counts, number counts, etc. We're not reducing people to metrics. We are saying, as Professor Zamani put it, we need to develop metrics for people about things that concern their quality of life. And of course, everything that Professor Donati said about the norms that people employ, the norms that are diffused through television, media various, some of them rather nefarious, such as Facebook. I don't hesitate to name this as a negative normative influence. All imply that if there is such a thing as morality, we are talking about people who already and inalienably possess one crucial aspect of human dignity. They have moral judgment. They judge what matters in their lives and what kind of life they want to live. They are not the billiard balls of positivism which are just pushed about and respond and go in the direction of the strongest push. And just a small government health warning. The social sciences reinvent their errors in every generation. Billiard ball was the term that I think was used when the three of us were graduating in social sciences. Vulnerability is today's one. And this frightens me. It is perfectly correct to trace the word back to the Latin vulneris for wound, but one is susceptible. One is vulnerable to something. One is not vulnerable to court. Because that is to advocate the passive agent who has no control over their circumstances, and however poor somebody becomes, they never become so poverty-stricken that they have no choice whatsoever about their course of action, even though these courses of action may be immensely constrained compared with the luxuries that most of the rest of us enjoy. So can I hand over finally to our Chancellor for the connection between normativity, ethics, morality, and human dignity.
Thank you.
For your help. You are very helpful.
Oh, I think that I am very grateful for Margaret to give me to can speak. But of course, we had many ideas, many suggestions, and from all the fronts, from the religions, from science, from philosophy, from natural sciences, and from social sciences. And we have emergencies, we can say, and it's not easy to find the connections of these emergencies, but there are emergencies. And one is the question of climate change, the global warming, and we can say that the Academy was the first to put this problem 30 years ago. We have here the person that was the leader of this, that is Professor Crutzen, that also invented a word that is anthropic climate, because the climate is determined by the actions, the human actions. And of course, we have also the approach of the social sciences that we see that is very important, because in this new school that we can say that is led by Margaret Thatcher, the sociology is not only and positivistic information about statistics or about the influence of the structures, but the real responsibility that have each human being, the agency. Margaret published many books about this, and that is the responsibility that have any person in front of the nature, in front of the other persons. And in this point, we can say that I was very impressed, because when we have the meeting of the religious leaders that was here in the screen, but at this moment it's not, was very interesting, because one of the religious leaders, there are many here, but one was the patriarch of the ecumenical patriarch, and Bartolomeo. And he said there are a real connection between the problem of the new form of slaves and the problem of climate change. And also the representative of Al-Azhar, that is the Muslims, say more or less the same. Really, it's not easy to can explain all the connection, but it's clear that are two emergencies, very important. And for this reason, these emergencies are in the center of the program of the Pope, because, as many times we say, and the Pope say, his program is the Beatitudes of the Gospel. And the Beatitudes is informed more concretely, more existential, more realistic about the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is only a philosophical or theological affirmation. We need to recognize the other as we recognize ourselves. But in the Beatitudes, the other is the other that suffer, the other that have the poor of the hair, the other that have misericord, the other that try to suffer for the justice, the other that try to have a world more pacific. And these are the concrete things that the Pope have in his heart and in his program. And for this, I think these two emergencies are very central. And of course, what are the people to suffer more? It's not easy to say, but it's clear that the people to be today slave in a new form of slave, or because it's a slave of forced labor, or because it's a slave by the prostitution that in the majority of the cases is not a choice, or because suffer the organ trafficking, or suffer to be a slave of the drugs. These are really the great problems of the great emergence for the society, and have a relation also for the climate, as say many people, but I think anyway the relation is because are emergencies. And I was very happy this morning because the Pope, in his dialogue with the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, just speak about this. I remember say, look, I have, of course, the problem of the climate is a very important problem, but I am very concerned also about the question of the work. People don't have work. I am very concerned also about the question of the new form of slaves. And we want to work together to resolve this problem. We can resolve this problem. And the origin of this meeting was to support the encyclical of the Pope that maybe have an approach pastoral that support this with the reasons of the scientific reason that we heard, and also for the social reasons that we also heard. But in the end, the encyclica also, in a parallel way, support also the program, the new program of the United Nations, that is to have social inclusion, to have sustainable development, and to have of course, a new form of climate. And we try also to, and the Pope tried also this morning, to suggested target and suggested little change of the targets. And I think that this is also very important because these new objectives can guide the humanity in this future, immediate future. But I think that was another thing very important because the Secretary General said to the Pope, I want also that we have a support of the sport. And this is also a coincidence with the Pope, because the Pope also wants to have, from the Academy, an initiative for education, to have an award in education. And by the way, was very important, this last consideration on education. We need to put, we have here many professors, many leaders, and it's very important to put in the universities these two emergencies in the formation, in the awareness of the new generations, the problem of the climate and the problem of the new form of slaves, and these things that need to be present in the universities. The universities need to become like was in the origin, to put questions and to resolve these questions, but the questions that are in the contemporary world are not questions that are repetitions, infinite repetition of the things that are not necessary today. And I think the Pope wants that we can help to do all this with the sport. And we organize here, with the initiative of the Pope, 3 matches of football, and this was a great contribution to not only, as said the Pope, that the sport come back, that was in his origin also to be a sport not only to obtain profit, but to really be like was the Olympiads in the Greeks, to be a form of manifestation of the humanity and sociability and a good competition. But not only this could be important for the sport, but also the help that can be by the sport and to the other institutions, very important to this program to affront this more important emergence that we have today. Thank you very much.